Num num. Birdie num num.
When I have understanding of computers, I shall be the supreme being. God isn't interested in technology. He knows nothing of the potential of the microchip or the silicon revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrots. Nipples for men.
Don't do that, Jesus Christ! You're gonna get me killed!
Out of here!
Oh, Billy.
I have nipples, Greg. Could you milk me?
Welcome, everybody, to Aeon Bite. Welcome to the desert of the real and happy heresies. We are writing our own gospel and we are living our own myth. We are running with those searching for the truth and avoiding those who have found it. My name is Miguel Connor. Welcome you with arms wide open. For some reason, I keep quoting Creed out of all bands. It's in my head. But I am your Pompatus of Gnosis. And very excited to have you on this Tuesday for a very special show and a book that I really enjoyed, a book I couldn't put down. And it opened a lot of new vistas on a very popular, legendary, and often controversial figure. And that is Stanley Kubrick. And with us, I can't think of anybody better to do this than my friend Steven Snider, who will be discussing, his new book, The Minotaur, a Kubrick Odyssey. Steven, how are you doing?
Doing well, sir, and it's great to be back here. Thank you very much for having me tonight.
Always enjoy hosting you, regardless of where it is, whether it's Memphis, Astronosis, Virtual, anywhere. It's always a lot of fun hanging with you. And with us, too, we've got Graham. Graham, how are you doing?
Doing very well this evening. Looking forward to hearing about the more of the hidden side of Kubrick.
There's a lot. And I think what I like about Steven's book is that he dispels a lot of some of these conspiracies, and he brings a lot of humanity into Kubrick, which makes it almost kind of a touching book, I would say, a personal book. I mean, Steven, he is your favorite director, right? As you say in your book.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel like a big part of why I do what I do today is because of Kubrick. He was the first artist I feel like I really had a personal connection with. I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I actually did die on the day I did cry on the day that Stanley Kubrick died in 1999. So it's definitely something that's been with me for a while. And your part of me did die too when he of
course. Something new came out. Do you have a favorite movie of his?
I would say Dr. Strangelove and Eyes Wide Shut would have been my longtime favorites, though in more recent years I've really started to warm up to Barry Lyndon as well.
Yeah, I definitely need to rewatch that one. It kind of gets overlooked, and it's interesting too. I would have to say Dr. Strangelove for me, and yes, I have to bring it up. That was Elvis's favorite Kubrick movie. In fact, that was one of his favorite movies all the time. He would walk around and annoy people, saying, "Gentlemen, you can't fight here. This is the war room." And Elvis was a big Peter Sellers fan. I mean, fan. I've always been huge.
He screened it in Graceland a couple of times, didn't he, right?
Yeah. He would rent out the whole theater in the middle of the night and just sit there with Priscilla and his gang. And sometimes fans would be outside. Sometimes he would bring them in and say, "Look, just be quiet, sit. I'm paying for everything." And I think he watched Dr. Strangelove, and he kept telling the guy, "Please, play it again. I want to see the scene." But then he was able to get the film or whatever you call it, and he did screen it at Graceland as well. So
fantastic! It's a kind of a nice little synchronistic touch there, since you and I obviously went to Graceland back in November, late October, somewhere thereabouts, which I think was right around the time I was getting ready to start working on this book. So
no, really. Yeah, I can't wait to get back, and this time to go to Tupelo. So so much there. But you'd already done, I mean, this book, you didn't start it from scratch, because I've seen you talk about it, do presentations in other places. This was basically just putting together your years of research, or what was the process, Stephen?
Well, like I said, like you said, it definitely was something that I've been kind of working on for years. I guess the genesis went back to a series of articles I did on my blog, Vise Up, on the film Dr. Strangelove. I think all the way back, what's up, Lyle? All the way back, I think, in like 2013, 2014 or something. And for years, that was the only thing I had really done on Kubrick. I think fast forward to like 2023, Jimmy Fallon Gong had talked about having me on Program to Chill to do a Kubrick thing, because he was a big fan of Dr. Strangelove too. So I decided to do a presentation on that. And that was the first time I'd really started to kind of toy around, like organizing all of my Kubrick research in forever. And I decided from there that I would probably go out and do a presentation on Kubrick for the Strange Realities Conference, and it just ended up becoming a massive thing working on that. So I ended up deciding to do a stream for that, I think around like November or something like that of 2023. I invited and all the Secret Sun kids, they really dug it. So Chris invited me back to do Eyes Wide Shut. So for December 2023. So by this point in time, I compiled a ton of information, and I started working on the book formally around January, February of this year. But even then, it was like I had, I think, something like 30,000 words or something written from all the presentations when I spliced everything together, but there were no footnotes. And I ended up really reorganizing everything tremendously and wrote another, I think, 40,000 additional words or something. So I was kind of shocked. I mean, almost all of this came together in about 3 months or something like that. So I ended up doing a lot more additional writing on that than I had thought that I would do. But I mean, it did almost kind of practically write itself. And as you alluded to, it was also, I think, in a lot of ways, maybe the most personal thing I've written as well.
Yeah, indeed, and it's a great read. I read it in a couple of days, and it's a page turner. So, of course, I love the fact you have the footnotes at the bottom of the page. God, I hate endnotes. You got to go back and look, and then you got to flip back, and you got when the footnotes are at the bottom, it's like, aha, now I can look at his references and what else he's quoting. And yes, speaking of conferences, people, Stephen will be returning to the Astronosis 3 conference August 9th and 10th. As you may know, the theme is Sophia and Simulated Realities. And, Stephen's going to give us a good presentation on simulated realities. We'll be having the exact topics and schedule in the next month. So it's going to be great. And then Stephen, again, he's a blast to hang out with, and who knows, sometimes don't you do some tours whenever you're in a different part of the country?
No, I was actually just going to bring that up. If anyone is interested, shoot me a message, because I do think that I am actually going to be going to House on the Rock around the time that I'm up there, either right before or right after the con. I was actually going to see if you wanted to come with me, Miguel, or any of the other speakers and so forth. So yeah, definitely let me know. It'll be an all-day thing, because I always insist when I take people to House on the Rock that you got to go to Taliesin East, Frank Lloyd Wright's studio first. Because you really got to experience the dichotomy between those two places to get the full experience. But it's quite an adventure going to House of the Rock. So yeah, if anybody's interested, definitely let me know. It's kind of another little bonus you get from coming up to this wonderful conference here. I usually find something weird in the area to go out to, and this time around I wanted to open it up to people who are interested in attending with me. I'm still kind of bouncing back and forth on what I'm going to do my presentation on. I've been compiling a lot of information on a girl called Columbia for the last year and a half or so, which I could do something really fun on, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to resist the whole notion of simulated realities. I got a lot of stuff that I've been doing with that. It kind of plays into this presentation I just did at Philosophical Research Society and the Fortean Society. So who knows, maybe I'll expand on some of this and some of the material that's going to be in my next book. But I'll definitely have something cool for everybody, in addition to possibly some adventures at House on the Rock.
Cool. Yeah. Well, yeah, I might take you up on it. I know there's a lot of, I haven't taken advantage, a lot of burial mounds, maybe an hour south in Illinois, in Ohio. Of course, Wisconsin is full of them. So, yeah, there is something to do here beyond, of course, the mystical essence of the Theosophical Society and all that stuff. So, yeah, please join us at Astronosis 3. Should be bigger than last time. The guest list is continued to growing, and we are going to have, it's going to be an amazing couple of days. And yeah, it's just the fraternity, the fellowship, the exchange of ideas, the fun times, and of course the information is just invaluable. And again, it's so important for us to connect on a personal level. Technology is great, but ultimately we're just we're just pixels right now. It's an illusion, and it's great for exchanging information and starting friendships, but yeah, but making that egregore and connecting and interpersonal ways is just it really uplifts your spirit and gives you a sense of freedom and just joy. That yeah,
No, it
we're not so
absolutely is.
alone, we together we are really strong.
I can't emphasize that enough. It's just great to go out and have these experiences with everyone. This is, it's a big part of what I've really been trying to do for the last couple of years or so. I was just in LA. I actually managed to throw my first rave at 41 years old in LA,
Awesome.
remarkably,
Cool.
with Dimitri from Subliminal Jihad. But I mean, it was, same thing. We wanted to try to create a forum where these different communities could come together in real life. Everybody could exchange ideals, have some fun, and we largely succeeded, I hope, in doing that. And this is another aspect of that, a much bigger one, a better organized one on that note as well. So yeah, definitely give it a lot of thought, guys. If you're anywhere near the area, I can't emphasize how much fun this kind of stuff is. Be great for me because I'm not going to be having to work the door at the same time as doing presentations and stuff like I did at the rave, but so it goes.
Yeah, Steven the bouncer. Awesome.
Yeah, no, there was. I hope everybody appreciated that. You're showing up for the rave where, like, I'm going to be the speaker there, and I'm also the guy out there working the door, taking your ticket too. So
Yeah. I worked as a bouncer when I was young. I worked everywhere in the service industry. Dishwasher, I was a cook, a bartender, you name it, I've done it. A drug dealer.
that's why we get along so well, Miguel.
We were down on the trenches, yes. Awesome. Yeah, and for everybody in the chat, good to see everybody there. Please, if you have any questions or complaints against Graham or me, super chat them so that we can separate them. Please support this show, like, subscribe, support it any way you can. Support Steven's Patreon. On mine, you can do it for as low as $1 a month because I know these are hard times. But yeah, let's keep this independent research going because it's essential. It is civilization saving at this point. So, well, let's let's get into your book, Steven. I think one of the first I don't say conspiracy or tropes that I wanted to tackle on Stanley Kubrick is people always assume that he was just this control freak. He took, 80 shots because he had to have everything. And he was just this, very cold, machine-like, perfectionist, type A personality, whatever you want to call him. But as you write and argue, that's not reality, is it?
Well, certainly not. And one of the things that, as I had started to research Kubrick's career, some of these sort of eccentricities that are usually held up as evidence of his cruelty, like the 80 takes and that kind of thing, start to make a lot more sense. Because on the one hand, Kubrick used a lot of techniques that he borrowed from the surrealists. And I think that this included a variation on the cut-up method for when he was editing his films. He certainly used a variation on the exquisite corpse when he was writing the screenplays. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is one of the reasons why he did all these different takes, so that he would have them to draw from. But on top of that, I think it really just gets down to Kubrick really not knowing what he was looking for in terms of the performances from the actors in a given scene. So his approach in those circumstances was to film as many possible takes as you could to try to get a whole just stratosphere of reactions And then when you go back to the editing process, you can essentially piece together the performance exactly as you want it. And this is sort of something, again, when you see a lot of actors going back and talking about working with Kubrick and how they'll say that the performance that ended up on stage or on screen was not what they thought that they were giving to the director. He ended up using a lot of takes that they thought that he would never use, this kind of thing. In a lot of cases, you end up with something on screen that is quite different from what the participants thought that they were going for when they filmed it. Kubrick would have definitely loved AI. I think that he actually would have almost liked to have totally foregone the process of working with the actors, so he could just basically construct the performance from scratch, right up to the whim at the given moment when he was editing it, essentially.
Yeah, like you said, it's not the surrealists, but also the Dadaists,
Yes.
who were just, kind of just make it up as you go. And you talk about different examples. For example, there are continuity problems in The Shining. This does not show a maniac, control freak. And you talk about how he would write screenplays when he'd get together with his whatever partner, and they both sort of wrote things and just threw it together as a mashup. And it cracks me up because I'm just starting my David Bowie book. I don't know what I'm doing it with Elvis. There's a voice. And who knows where it's going to take me, but Bowie had the same cut up style for much of his songwritings as well. Just cut it up, throw it in there, and hey, this is it. After what do you call it? Spiders of Mars, Ziggy Stardust. That became it because he loved William Burroughs, but after he met William Burroughs, who also used the cut up method for his novels, he was like, I'm going to try this. So it's interesting that they were all sort of borrowing for each other of this rich tradition of surrealism and Dadaism, right?
Oh,
and Jung too, because they were all looking for the unconscious. Like, what's it going to bring out?
Well, another influence, I didn't really get into this as much in the book, but I think that it would certainly be clear with Kubrick's creative approach, and really probably Bowie's too, but jazz. Specifically jazz improvisation. You got to remember Kubrick was a jazz drummer from way back when he was in high school, and he continued to drum throughout his life, even though a lot of people don't realize this. But I definitely think too that the process of improvisation as it goes into jazz was another thing that heavily influenced his filmmaking. And that was just generally one of the more remarkable things that I came to appreciate about Kubrick in writing this book, and a lot of the presentations that led up to it, was just how much improvisation was important to his filmmaking process. Because you always think of Kubrick as being this very cold, clinical, methodical filmmaker. He does, years worth of research and what have you, which he definitely did. But when it came time to actually filming the movies, he was always open to these just sort of spur of the moment, almost random accidents that would occur during filmmaking. And I think that was a testament to just, what a complete filmmaker he really was, because despite all of the preparation, he was not oblivious to a good idea when it just sort of randomly happened in front of him,
Exactly. And other characteristics which are great, like how even when he started out as a film director, he had to make money through gambling, playing cards, chess. I mean, he was a high roller, wasn't he? A risk taker.
Yeah, no, definitely. Throughout the 50s, he largely supported himself as a professional gambler, as you said, both is playing money for chess, going back to his time in New York. But I mean, later when he was in Hollywood, he basically supported himself in the late 50s as a gambler. And these are like really high stake games. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people here are kind of familiar with the scandals that came out. Like, I guess it was maybe about a decade ago with Tobey Maguire and some of these kinds of games. But yeah, if you sort of see the recent movie Babylon, where ironically they have Tobey Maguire in there as this sort of gangster character, there's a lot of these allusions to these high stakes gambling games that were going on in Hollywood. These were the kind of games that Kubrick was in on, and that was partly how he was able to sustain himself during the leaner years of his career.
Yeah, pretty hardcore stuff. Also, I love, of course, there's a trope that he was afraid for his life, and he had a chauffeur, and he couldn't drive more than 35 miles an hour or something like that. But then, as you write, he was kind of the opposite when he drove. He's like the most distractive driver with a cigarette, looking around, almost getting into wrecks. It kind of goes. He wasn't this careful, I might die kind of guy, was he?
Well, yeah, he had such a compelling amount of contrast with that, because like you're saying, he was an absolutely terrible driver. That's something that everybody who knew him agreed upon, even though they tried to push back against it. But there actually is quite a bit of compelling evidence that at different points he did not allow his drivers to go over 35. Emilio was different. Emilio de Alessandro, who was his longtime driver and personal assistant, Emilio could drive the speed limits. Practically everybody else could not, though. So, but yeah, another thing too with Kubrick is he was a really heavy smoker. I think he had started smoking when he was like 12 years old, if I'm not mistaken. Continued to smoke pretty heavily, I think, all the way up through Barry Lyndon, and never really gave it up. He would always go back to smoking cigarettes during his films, even with eyes wide shut. So this is sort of another thing with Kubrick when you think of him having this kind of pathological fear of death, if you will. But this was a guy who was a really, really heavy smoker throughout his life. And again, it's not really talked about a lot, but he was actually a certified pilot. He did fly himself quite a bit in the 1950s prior to supposedly developing this all-consuming fear of flying. But this was one of the things I kind of argued in the book, is that at least some of these eccentricities might have been the result of a real fear that Kubrick had of being assassinated, which, as I, again, had started to research his life, I did not think that that was as outlandish as it seems, because there's a lot of documentation that Kubrick definitely thought that somebody would try to assassinate him at various points in his life. And I had always kind of wondered, was this just some of the, kind of legendary paranoia? But the more I looked into this, there were some pretty serious threats made to his life at different points.
For sure, yeah. Again, reminds me of, I think he used to smoke 3 packs of Gitan a day. Gitan is this French cigarette. If I have one Gitan, it's like hardcore. And he was also, Bowie went through a period when he was afraid of flying. Elvis went through a period, again, both for 10 years. They would not get on an airplane.
I think Bowie was also an extreme workaholic like Kubrick. That's like another thing. Kubrick only slept about 4 or 5 hours a day for about his entire life.
Really?
Yeah, when he made his movies, he worked like 18 hours a day in a lot of cases. That's probably a big reason why he died at 69, 70 years old, because the guy, he wrote himself hard. He really, really did.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting, these artistic types. So now that we know that Kubrick wasn't this again methodical control freak, what of course the great conspiracy, and you address this in his book, is the moon landing. Tell us about what people get wrong about the moon landing, especially truthers and people in the occult.
Well, pretty much everything. So I just want to emphasize, in talking about this, I'm not saying that that the moon landing was not possibly faked. I'm not saying that it was faked, but I'm not saying that it was not necessarily faked either. So that's not really the point, I think, when you get into the question of whether Kubrick faked the moon landing. So this was obviously something that I had to do a lot of research on, because I knew people would be freaking out if I didn't try to really methodically address this topic. So this led to me basically trying to get back to the root causes where this came from. And it turned out that Kubrick being linked to the moon landing and the moon landing being faked goes back to pretty much the beginning of this particular trope. So there was a book published by, I think it was Bill Casing, called Did We Ever Go to the Moon, or something to that effect. It came out in 75, 74, thereabouts. And this was essentially the very first book to seriously question whether or not the Apollo moon landings actually happened, if you will. And Casing would continue to be one of the main guys in this particular strand of research for a lot of years. And in this book, he did bring up Kubrick, but it's important to emphasize that he never actually argued that Kubrick faked the moon landing. Casing thought that Kubrick, that specifically 2001, had been used by NASA to develop the technology that would be necessary to fake the moon landing. But the Kubrick himself did not participate in this. And Casing's evidence for this was basically that the budget of 2001 was doubled during production, and the litany of agencies that took part in it. And nominally, this is something that maybe seems somewhat suspicious, but not in the broader context of Kubrick's career. On the one hand, it was pretty common for his movies to go over budget. In fact, the uptick in budget in Barry Lyndon was far, far more substantial than what it was for 2001. I think Barry Lyndon, it went up like, wow. I think it was like, what, 4 million to start off with. It went up to like 12 million. So, I mean, it like tripled. Whereas I think with 2001, it only doubled from 4 to 8 million or something. And then on top of that, it was really common for Kubrick to consult with a wide variety of agencies, with experts in any given field that he was making a movie on. And you can see this as well with like Dr. Strangelove, because everybody sort of points out like, well, he was consulting with NASA, and NASA had all these people going out here to work with him, which they did. But it was the same thing with Dr. Strangelove. He's consulting with all these national security experts. There's really lines in Dr. Strangelove that actually appear to have been taken directly from what would have been very classified National Security Council meetings at the time. A lot of interesting stuff with all that nobody actually ever really seems to talk about very much. So Kubrick always used these sort of insiders as technical advisors. And depending upon the film, for instance, like with his Napoleon epic that he never got to make, I mean, he hired, I think, something like 30 Napoleonic scholars to work with him while he was working on the screenplay for this, and to help him devise the settings and the costumes and all this other kind of crap. He did the same thing for Barry Lyndon. For Full Metal Jacket, he brought in all kinds of experts to recreate, Marine Corps basic training, all this other kind of stuff. So this was an obsession with him. He always wanted to get as close as possible to the realistic presentation of the topics that he was addressing. So he always consulted experts. And again, there's nothing unusual in Kubrick consulting with NASA for 2001 in the context of how he made movies. So what gets really interesting with the Kubrick conspiracies as it sort of unfolds is that the guy, or the person who really probably platformed Casing, was Mae Brussel. She had him, they actually lived fairly close to each other in Carmel, I should point out, in California, and she had Casing on several times on her show. And he actually hosted her radio broadcast, I think, on a couple of episodes when she was out as well. So for those of you unaware, Mae Brussel was legendary talk radio conspiracy theorist. She was one of the early titans. She's really one of the major liberal kind of conspiracy talk radio people, along with I cannot remember the guy's name now off the top of my head. Well, anyway, he's not my favorite person in the world, so probably best. But anyway, Mae Brussel was a really, really big deal. But the thing about Mae that's especially interesting is that she, in turn, really was platformed and really given an audience from Paul Krasner, the longtime editor-in-chief of The Realist. Krasner had a lot of interesting connections. He was a bit of a Discordian. He knew Robert Anton Wilson. He knew the Yippies with Abby Hoffman and all these other people. Worked for Larry Flint. He knew Hugh Hefner and this whole Playboy crowd. And Krasner also did a lot of interesting parapolitical research in his own right. Some of his stuff on Manson and the Zodiac killings, for instance, is still some of the better research that you're going to find Krasner was one of the first guys to like really seriously look at the angle of celebrity pornography and the Manson killings, for instance, which I've always felt was a really big aspect of that. So Krasner had a lot of sources. He was very aware of some of these sketchy scenes in LA at the time. And he worked with Mae Brussel on a lot of this stuff. He became enamored with her JFK assassination research. And that was what led him to help her get this radio show that became a real cult classic by the 1970s. So here was the thing with Kubrick. Kubrick loved The Realist. He was a subscriber of The Realist going all the way back to the late 1950s, right when Krasner first launched the publication, okay? And he liked The Realist so much that it was an enormous influence on the humor of Dr. Strangelove. So much so that he actually wanted to hire Lenny Bruce at one point to write the screenplay for Dr. Strangelove. Bruce turned him down, and that was when they looked to Terry Southern, who was another guy very closely connected with The Realist, along with Lenny Bruce. Both of these guys contributed articles. They were both friends of Krasner and so forth. So Kubrick was very influenced by this whole milieu around The Realist. He was an avid reader of it, at least up until the time that he was making 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I have to think that there was a very, very strong possibility that Paul Krasner would have known Kubrick was a reader. Because again, when Kubrick subscribed in the late 50s, The Realist probably only had like 200 or 300 subscribers. It was very much a cult publication at this point in time. So this raises a lot of really interesting possibilities when you start thinking about how Mae Brussel, her radio show, is bringing casing on, and he's talking about Kubrick being involved in all of the NASA stuff and the fake moon landing. And I have really started to wonder if this was a case of Kubrick possibly trolling conspiracy theorists and also perpetuating his own legacy and mythology. Because Kubrick, he was a megalomaniac. You got to understand that. Kubrick wanted to be perceived as something other than a regular filmmaker. A Stanley Kubrick movie wasn't just a movie. It was an event. It was something you were supposed to tell your kids about what you were doing when you saw this Stanley Kubrick movie. So on the one hand, Kubrick putting out rumors that he helped fake the moon landing would have perpetuated this myth. It would have continued to elevate Stanley Kubrick above the level of being a normal director. And then on the other hand, as I just kind of alluded to, Kubrick had a pretty pucky sense of humor, very dry. I definitely think Kubrick would have gotten a real laugh out of this, having somebody like Mae Brussel coming on air and talking about how he was possibly involved in the moon landing hoax. And if Paul Krasner knew that Kubrick was a reader, I definitely think Krasner would have appreciated the humor to that as well, to put it mildly. And certainly, I don't think he would have been able to resist if Kubrick had possibly suggested to him that they should work to creating this myth.
And what about the concept of the NASA cameras that Kubrick used? You dispel that one too. That's been lingering for years.
Yeah, he didn't get the cameras specifically from NASA for Barry Lyndon. They were actually at a company with Germany that NASA had sold to them secondhand, and it was one of his kind of gophers who went around the world looking for camera technology that found them. So yeah, it wasn't even something where like NASA just, I mean, the whole notion of that, I think, is just absolutely ridiculous in the first place. It's like Stanley Kubrick fakes the moon landing, and NASA is willing to do something wonderful for him for doing all of this. And the thing that Kubrick asked them for is a camera that he can film by candlelight with. Like, seriously? Like, all the stuff he could have asked for. No, I just want a candle that I can film by candlelight with. I don't even want the budget for my Napoleon movie. Fuck that. Just give me the camera.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Again, we've got Stephen Snider. We're discussing his book, The Minotaur, a Stanley Odyssey. Graham, do you have any questions or comment for Stephen?
I was going to sit there and put my vote in for Barry Lyndon. That's probably been one of my favorite
I'm
Kubrick
telling you, Barry
films for a long
Lyndon's
time.
freaking rules, man. It is awesome.
The performance he got out of Ryan O'Neal there, it was just—it's amazing.
Yeah, no, it
Subtleties
really
he got out
is.
of Ryan that are not in Ryan.
Well, again, that kind of goes into the whole thing of him constructing the performance through the edits. So, and yes, I very much think that is a case where you could see Kubrick basically using editing to elicit something out of the actor that they may not have been capable of on their own accord, so to speak. It's kind of interesting. I'm glad you said that too, because I just had the debate with Jason Horsley over the quality of acting in Kubrick movies, which I certainly would argue that most of the performances are not naturalistic in the slightest, what Jason defined as bad acting, which, I mean, again, I think there's some legitimacy to that from a certain point of view, but I think you also kind of have to go into you got to take into account like what the intention was. In a lot of cases, Kubrick was not looking for a naturalistic performance from his actors. But in the case of Ryan O'Neal and Barry Lyndon, as you say, that really is a fantastic performance. And I think that's really a great instance that shows that Kubrick could get a really, really strong performance out of an actor, and specifically an actor that's not even known for being phenomenally talented, to put it mildly, if he really wanted to. So I do think that's a good point, because it does fly, I think, against the typical conventions in terms of how Kubrick approached acting in his films.
What about terrorizing Shelley Duval? Or is that true?
Well, there's
beat her down until.
Well, what's interesting about that is that, again, it kind of seems like this is something where Kubrick actually perpetuated that myth on his own accord, because a lot of that comes out of the documentary that his daughter Vivian Kubrick had made while they were filming The Shining, and there's a lot of those scenes in there where Kubrick seems to be giving her pretty rough treatment. But my understanding is he actually had that edited in a way that made him seem much harsher with Duval than the way that he actually treated her on the whole over the course of the production. So that's kind of like another one where, yeah, I mean, he was a little rough with her during the film, but it kind of seems like he deliberately exaggerated the amount of cruelty that he was engaged in that instance.
Exactly. Yeah. So much myth making. Yeah. And you brought up Jason Horsley. For those of you who don't know, he did come on the show to talk about his book, The Kubrickon, which is an excellent book. And yeah, as soon as I started opening yours, I was like, damn, the Kubrickon and Stephen's book have to be like companion pieces, the Boas or whatever pillars of the Kubrick secret society. Because they're both great and they do complement each other. And I love how you guys disagree. But what do you think of Jason's theory about how his movies were more of an experiment to challenge consciousness, control consciousness, mine the human consciousness for data, and the climax would be the AI apotheosis or something like that? I think that's more or less one of his theories in the Kubrickon, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it was definitely, my book was very much meant to be a companion piece to Jason's. It was a big part of what inspired me to write it in the first place. It was sort of ironic because some of the research that I had been doing for the art trilogy, I had passed on to Jason when I was in the process of writing that particular book, the first installment, which I came out with last year. And then Jason used that as sort of the part of the basis for his Kubrick book, and then I came back and read his Kubrick book, which was partly built on my research. And I was like, oh, well, I've got to do a response to this. So it's kind of interesting, the genesis of like these two works, how much they really kind of bled out of like similar creation, if you will. But no, I definitely thought that Jason was really on to something like that. I mean, I thought one of his most striking theories was how Kubrick had almost designed his films as a reflective mirror, if you will, where what the viewer takes into the film is almost reflected back to them in terms of the symbolism and so forth. And I think the apex of this was really The Shining, which is also, I think, the movie where he really went as, all in really with a lot of these surrealist techniques that we've talked about. But I told Jason this story as well, but when I was working on my Kubrick book, I must have watched The Shining like 20 times over like the span of 2 weeks. Ooh. And I would go into it, just sort of like thinking, well, if I think about The Shining as being a metaphor for this, is it possible that it'll come off as being a metaphor for this? So I'm kind of going in like, okay, The Shining, I'm going to try to see it this time as an allegory for the murders that happened at Taliesin East, Frank Lloyd Wright's estate that I was just talking about there. Yeah. So I go back and watch, and I was like, it really does seem like an allegory. And then I'm thinking, no, I'm just insane. So like, I would talk to a couple of my buddies, who knew the Frank Lloyd Wright case pretty well with his mistress being killed there. And I was like, just kind of casually mention it. Like, didn't you guys think maybe Kubrick was getting into that with The Shining? And they would go back and watch and come to me like, dude, it's amazing. You're absolutely right. This is an allegory. I can't believe I never saw the Frank Lloyd Wright connection before. But it's like, it's just so amazing. You can see it as just this, as a metaphor for the moon landing, for pedophilia, for genocide, for the Holocaust of the Native American Jews, or just, it's such a...
It's almost like a psychic honey trap. As you write, Playboy and Cielo Drive were real honey traps. This is a honey trap for our consciousness, our projection, everything.
And that's and that's where, I know some people think Jason's theories on that were really outlandish, but I swear, especially in this case with The Shining, I really do feel like with the way he designed this movie, it almost does interact with your consciousness while you're viewing it. Which again is why I, certainly would consider Kubrick to be the greatest director of all time, because I don't think anybody has ever made movies quite like this before. And it's like I was telling Jason, I don't think I would actually rank one of Kubrick's movies in my top 20 all-time favorite films. Probably top 30, certainly top 40, top 50, but I don't think a single one would turn up in the top 20. But like I just said, I could watch The Shining 20 times in the span of 2 weeks, and that's not even my favorite Kubrick film. It's probably not even my top 3 favorite Kubrick films. And I found that this just seems to be the case with all of his movies. I can rewatch these films endlessly, always find something new to it, something really interesting thematically that I had never considered before. And in the case of The Shining, depending upon what you bring into it, when you go back and rewatch it, it's almost like an entirely new experience. And I just don't think that there's ever been a director that's managed to make movies that affected me as a viewer in this capacity. So in that sense, at least I personally can forgive Kubrick his egomania, because I do think that it was warranted. Nobody in my mind, the closest I think you even get to this would be David Lynch. And even then, I just don't think that Lynch still was close to Kubrick's level in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. And what would you say is the 1 or 2 points where you and Jason disagree the most? Obviously, the big one is he does not like Stanley.
Yeah, I think that's...
He's very open about his hatred for his directing style in movies.
That's like the weird thing is, like, even though we like fundamentally disagree about Kubrick, we actually more or less agree like on everything else. But like I said, it's like, we have like these I guess issues almost of semetics. It's like how Jason defines the acting. Like he would say it's bad acting. I would say that it's unconventional acting. But it's like we both agree that there's something unnatural about the acting. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's kind of like, so that's where it's hard to say how much we really fundamentally disagree, I think, beyond the fact that I like Kubrick and Jason doesn't. But despite that, it seems like we can both watch his movies endlessly as well and still find new things in them every time. So I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. But I agree with Jason what again Kubrick was doing. I think he was a master Jungian and he had this power. I think he understood where technology was heading to. So he knew it'd be AI and the whole idea of social engineering and all that. I agree with you. I don't think it was part of the deep state, but you can expand on that if you want. But I do agree very much with you. One of your central thesis that you say Eyes Wide Shut in 2001 are like twin flames. And what they show is Kubrick is showing the world, or he's recreating a Neoplatonist theurgy ritual, or a Gnostic out of body fly the stars ritual. Isn't that what he's doing? I mean, he really was trying to show us this.
Yeah, that's very much my take on that. And I mean, I've said this is, I think, another point, Jason, I disagree on. I personally think 2001 is one of the most spiritual movies of the Cold War era, if not ever. That's not something that Jason would agree with. Let's just leave it at that. But yes, I definitely very much see 2001 as Kubrick attempting to really revive Gnosticism and Neoplatonism within the context of contemporary ufology. And I know, as you and Chris, and I mean all these other wonderful people in the synchromystical community have been talking about for years now, Gnosticism and Neoplatonism really were the OG ancient astronaut religions. I mean, this was something that I tried to get into a bit in the Kubrick book, but I mean,
Right.
you can go back to some of the old Neoplatonist theurgic texts, and they're having debates in there as to whether or not the gods are in physical ships when they descend from the stars and this kind
Yeah.
of stuff. I mean, we've been having essentially the nuts and bolts argument, I mean, for a couple of thousand years now. It's not even like a new debate, really. And this is something that I really, really have to believe that Kubrick was fundamentally aware of. And certainly when you look at the development of 2001, again, it's like everybody focuses on the hard research that they did, the stuff that they were doing with NASA to try to accurately recreate space travel as much as they possibly could. But on the flip side of the coin, Kubrick was also doing a tremendous amount of research into mythology at the same time. I mean, it's pretty widely acknowledged that The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, very much Jungian when it comes to mythology, was a tremendous influence on 2001. But I definitely think that Kubrick was looking beyond simply Campbell in a broader context of mythology when he was making this film. And certainly he very much made the conscious decision about midway through production around 66, 67 to really go all in making the film as a spiritual statement. And this was something when Arthur C. Clarke originally saw 2001 and 68, he was actually rather horrified by this. I mean, he thought it was very pompous and pretentious, and, because he thought that they were going to make the first really serious big budget science fiction movie that was going to be as scientifically accurate as all. And Clarke, when he actually saw it in person, he accurately interpreted it as being a religious allegory and not a true science fiction film, which is exactly what Kubrick ended up making with this. And I think, to put into context, just the mystical interpretation that Kubrick had of the UFO phenomenon, you have to consider that at the same time, in the early phases when he was developing the script with Clarke, he was actually also looking into adapting the Shaver mysteries, which kind of like blew my mind at first when I read that. But the more I thought about it, I mean, it made so much sense that Kubrick would have been into this. But he certainly was aware of this really just sort of woo-woo interpretation of this stuff that was very prevalent in some of these ufology circles at the same time. And I think that ended up becoming a huge influence in his ultimate conception of the extraterrestrials. I mean, he famously had tried to develop special effects throughout production to depict them as physical beings. It failed. He ended up having to go back with what Carl Sagan had suggested in the first place, that you never see the extraterrestrials But later on, he himself had suggested that what you are witnessing are beings essentially that have evolved beyond human consciousness, or excuse me, that have beyond physical being into essentially beings of pure consciousness, pure energy, who also are existing outside of time and space. Essentially, they've broken through linear time, if you will, almost the whole cycle of time. So I think that at the core of this is a very, very Gnostic cosmology that he's revealing here. And I just think that once you start to look at it in that context, it's unavoidable. I just don't know that you can really view it to 2001 any other way once you become aware of that.
And then with 2001, as you write, and we're going to Eyes Wide Shut, another thing you have is the cult of Saturn, which of course is a secret society. It is an ancient mystical tradition, if you would, and basically, obviously, Eyes Wide Shut both kind of are nodding to Saturn.
Yeah. I mean, I think with 2001, you're seeing a theurgic ritual in which the consciousness is trying to ascend through the gates of Saturn. And with Eyes Wide Shut, you're sort of seeing the reverse of this, where they're trying to draw down this Saturnine energy into these rituals that the cult is conducting at Somerton. And in this context, to me, Kubrick is very much reflecting on possible esoteric traditions that do exist amongst the American, or I should say maybe more accurately, the Western elite. And certainly there have been suggestions that Kubrick was hinting at some kind of Saturnine cult for a considerable amount of time. And this was something that, in researching this, I was really trying to figure out if it was even possible if Kubrick would have been aware of something like this. I mean, obviously, the use of Christmas and Eyes Wide Shut, I mean, clearly this seems to have come from James George Fraser's interpretation of Saturnalia in The Golden Bough, which was a work that Kubrick was absolutely obsessed with. That was extremely influential, not just on his work, but his entire worldview. But in reviewing this, I found that one of the major sources Kubrick had used for research for Eyes Wide Shut was an obscure book called Cult and the Occult. Was able to track a copy of it down. It was quite fascinating. It has several sections, some of which deal with more mundane, quote unquote, esoteric knowledge, like tarot cards and astrology, all this kind of stuff. But it has several really extensive sections on sex magic. And there actually is an entire section on it, on the Brotherhood of Saturn and their specific approach to sex magic, which is interesting because at the time, when this book came out in the 1980s, there was actually very little written in English about the Brotherhood of Saturn. And for those of you unaware, this was sort of an offshoot of the OTO that was based out of Germany. They had a certain degree of notoriety in the Wagner Republic before the rise of the Nazi era. For you film fans out there, and this is another reason why I think that this would have been something that Kubrick would have zeroed in on, several members of the Brotherhood of Saturn were involved in the making of the classic Nosferatu. And in fact, there are some symbols from the Brotherhood of Saturn that were later used by the Brotherhood of Saturn in the film Nosferatu. So I definitely could see in this context that this would have been something that would have been absolutely fascinating to Kubrick because he was a fan of Nosferatu. So I was able to find the references in the book, and it seemed to me, based on that and some of the other symbolism that you see, i.e. a lot of the Saturnalia stuff, that Kubrick was very much trying to recreate in his interpretation what a modern cult of Saturn amongst the elite would have been like. And I think that this was something that he invested a considerable amount of time and probably resources in, because Eyes Wide Shut really sticks to the source material, Trauma Novelle, actually very closely. The storyline follows it almost entirely spot on. And the one exception to this is the whole subplot involving Ziegler and the whole cult and what have you. I mean, all the scenes involving Ziegler, those are pretty much the only things that you don't see in the novella that Kubrick had deliberately added. So he very much consciously wanted to bring this parapolitical angle into the film. And he very much reconceived what was essentially kind of an elite swingers party, if you will, in Trauma Nouvelle into this very ritualistic cult that ends up in the movie Eyes Wide Shut. So this is something that a lot of orthodox Kubrick scholars will bend over backwards to try to ignore. But to me, this is just something that is just so blatantly obvious. I mean, he deliberately went out of his way to add this entire subplot. He clearly did a tremendous amount of research into the ritualism that's displayed in this whole section, just into things that you see like in the background in terms of decorations and stuff in Ziegler's mansions. Because I've been to a fair amount of these elite residences now. I've been to the Biltmore, I've been to Moir's, I just went to the Hearst Castle in California last month, which actually has a ton of those 8-pointed stars like you see all over.
Oh, wow, Ishtar.
Yeah, but there's a lot of this kind of stuff. I mean, one point you see like Ziegler, there's the scene where they're at the pool room and there's like this fireplace in the background and there's this weird like just sea serpent like looking monster thing like by the fireplace, and they actually have this stuff at like a ton of these elite mansions. I mean, they've got them at Hearst Castle again, they got them at Biltmore. Some of the other references like the Venetian pews, you see some of these like Greco-Roman tapestries at Somerton. All this stuff is in these mansions.
Wow.
So this is stuff that Kubrick, in my mind, really did a lot of research, and there's just a lot of these like little Easter eggs like that hidden throughout Eyes Wide Shut with just the architecture alone that you're really not going to pick up on unless you've been to a lot of these residences and really, really paid a lot of attention to the stuff that they are furnished with. So it's something that I just don't think that you can ignore if you've really done the research on these topics.
Very much so, yeah. And the orgy is basically a Saturn ritual for the audience. You're right, there is no literature. Stephen Flowers put out a book about 3 years ago on the Brotherhood of Saturn. So if you want all the stuff there, he has it. And yeah, and in 2001, isn't it? It happens in Jupiter, right? But he simply couldn't do Saturn.
Yeah. He wanted it to be in Saturn, but they couldn't come up with the special effects in time for when they had to finish the movie. But yes, it was originally supposed to be them going to Saturn, and that's what it's like in the book. But they ended up having to do Jupiter in the film for practical reasons.
No, that makes sense. Graham, any super chats or question from you?
We have a super comment on from Chester. The comment on his comment was comment on the conspiracy world lore that Eyes Wide Shut was Kubrick's attempt to expose the elite practice of satanic sexual / sacrificial rituals, and that's what got him killed.
Well, again, as I've tried to talk about this before, but he's not showing a satanic ritual in Eyes Wide Shut. It is a Saturnine ritual. The only thing that's really consistent with the satanic ritual are actually the backwards priest chants that you hear, and that was something that they changed on the soundtrack. In fact, originally they had a Hindu prayer, which is what appeared in the theatrical version. So, and again, this is something that Kubrick would have been well aware of. But again, okay, so this is something I've talked about before, but to clarify to people about this, I believe that there very much was an elite tradition of satanic cults. But I'm going to say this with a caveat. These satanic cults have manifested in very specific environments historically. Typically, French and Catholic societies specifically. Mm-hmm. If you go back and you look at the really credible instances of satanic cults involving the elites, going back to Giles de Reyes, going on through like the affair of poisons, the sort of satanic chick craze that you had in France in the late 19th century, and so those Rosicrucian orders and all this good stuff, certain reoccurring threads you see in this. The first one is that these cults are almost always tied in with Catholic priests. This makes a lot of sense Because if you're going to do a proper black mass as it's prescribed as being done, there are certain prerequisites for this. So you got to have actual holy water and other implements that have been blessed by ordained priests. You and your buddies can't just pour a little tap water in a drain and say a couple of All Fathers over it and poof, you've got holy water. No, you need the real stuff for this. Secondly, you need to do an actual black mass in consecrated ground, which is why historic black masses have almost always been done in churches or the ruins of churches or something along those lines. Finally, you need an ordained priest to do this. This is another reoccurring thread with pretty much all black masks. They're done by ordained Catholic priests or their Protestant counterparts. Get into the whole show where you're going to have the priest say the mass backwards. A lot of times they copulate on the altar, this other kind of good stuff. You don't see any of that in Eyes Wide Shut. And again, given the tremendous amount of research that Kubrick did, as well as, say, references to what would essentially be satanic masses and the Golden Bough, all this other good stuff, I think that it's pretty fair to say that this is not what Kubrick was going for with Eyes Wide Shut. He was interested in the context of cults among the elites. I do think that there is a basis for a Saturnine cult that's being shown there. And he was interested in how this played into a lot of other scandals. I think the Perfumo scandal, for instance, was a clear reference point for Eyes Wide Shut. I think the incident involving Roy Radin and the whipping of Monica Heller, I think, can't remember exactly how her last name was pronounced, but this all happened in Long Island. This is tied into a lot of the stuff with Son of Sam. I think that was definitely something that Kubrick was looking at, and also the Heidi Fleiss stuff, which also was tied in with people tied in with Roy Radin and the Son of Sam stuff. I think there's a good chance that Kubrick was definitely aware of this. He had people in very close proximity to a lot of this stuff. Peter Sellers, for instance, was tied up in all this shit with Perfumo. There's a lot of weird stuff with that. There was a lot of occultic stuff that went on in that scandal, which basically brought down the UK government of Harold Macmillan in 1963. So I do think that Kubrick was aware of a lot of this stuff, but it's not this sort of QAnon narrative of satanic cults that were trying to be exposed. What he was doing was much more historically accurate and sophisticated. In terms of Kubrick being killed for this, again, Kubrick had smoked a lot of cigarettes since he was 12 years old. He, as we had just discussed before, typically only slept 4 to 5 hours a day and had done this for practically his entire adult life. The dude only ate microwave food. He had considerable amount of weight problems for the last 20 or so years of his life. On top of that, because of the amount of time that the shooting of The Shining went on, he had these elaborate sets that were constructed. They were constantly being bombarded with lighting throughout this process. A fire actually broke out in the set. But anyway, what I'm getting at with this is that a lot of chemicals were released during the filming of The Shining, which Kubrick was on the set for the entire production of. He would have soaked up all of this. He was also exposed to a lot of hostile chemicals when he was filming Eyes Wide Shut. So Kubrick was a 70-year-old man who had smoked heavily for almost 60 years, had barely slept more than 5 hours a day for approximately 50 years. Let's see here, had almost eaten nothing but microwave food for 20 years, had been obese for 20 years, had been exposed to a lot of toxic chemicals for over a year on the production of his last 2 films. Suffice to say, there's no shortage of reasons why Stanley Kubrick would have died around the time that he made Eyes Wide Shut. So
it's a miracle he made it that far.
Yeah.
That's a question.
You could almost ask, like, well, how did Kubrick actually live to make Eyes Wide Shut? As much as whether or not it was anything mysterious with him dying. So no, I don't think that he was killed to stop the expose. There were plenty of practical, rational reasons why Kubrick would have died when he did. And then on top of that, as to it happening in the editing, again, Kubrick was working 18-hour days. He was actually under a lot of pressure to finish the edits for the film to get it released at the time, because he was contractually obligated to have it out by the date that Ian Warner's had selected.
Oh, not when the anniversary of the moon landing?
It was the anniversary of the moon landing, but they only selected that date in 1998 after he had already been filming the movie for several years. And again, this whole thing is just ridiculous because so the theory was that Kubrick had it in his contract that they had to release Eyes Wide Shut on the date of the moon landing, right? So this is absurd for no other reason than Kubrick had not brought a movie in on time that he had filmed since, I think, The Killing. I don't even know if he ever actually brought one of his movies in on time. I mean, seriously, when Kubrick started filming Eyes Wide Shut, he thought that he would be finished by, I think, like late 1997, early 1998. About midway through 1997, he realized that it was going to be a little longer than that. So, yeah, the time frame when Kubrick even like finished shooting his movie was constantly evolving. I mean, he spent 400 days shooting this freaking movie, Eyes Wide Shut. There's no way that they had even begun to conceive of that when they went into production. I mean, it was only supposed to shoot for like 3 months. So this is the whole problem with Stanley Kubrick selecting a date and trying to stick to it. Stanley Kubrick goes into Eyes Wide Shut thinking that he can shoot it in 3 months. It takes him 400 days to shoot it. Kubrick knew that he had no freaking idea how long it was going to take him to make his movies. So I don't think that you could have paid the man enough money to try to, hammer out a date when he started the process of filming it.
Yeah, for sure. And for the audience, I agree with Steven that maybe the satanic mass was probably never like Rosemary's Baby sacrifice. It was more of simply a Christian left-hand path kind of way to gnosis, kind of, underground, if you would.
Well, I mean, I think Satanism really could be seen as a left-hand path version of Catholicism, actually.
Yeah. Well, this was experiential, though. It was more.
Yeah. I mean, like Rosemary's Baby, that's actually a good point. That's very much a movie you want to look at if you're trying to look at something hinting at a satanic cult among the elites. And again, a director who would have probably been in a position to know. But,
if there is a director.
But yeah, Kubrick is definitely interested in the notion of a cult amongst the elite, but it's a different kind of cult that he's looking at.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for that, Chester. Yeah, this is your chance. If you have a question for Steven, please super chat him and he will be glad to dispel any of the conspiracies or support them. Now, the one that you do kind of agree with or leave open, and you say you even start the paragraph, sadly, comma, is the idea of, I don't want to use the word on YouTube, child sexual attack or whatever you want to call it. That sort of sticks out, doesn't it, Steven? Or it's a door we cannot close. Let's put it that way.
I mean, it's undeniable. I mean, especially when you look at Lolita and a lot of the choices that he made in adapting that, where essentially you really see Humbert as almost a romanticized figure, as you will, and then just sort of the general, I think, almost the satire of the film and how he depicts these two sort of dueling pedophiles, if you will, between Quigley and Humbert. And when you get into The Shining, I just think that it's unavoidable with some of the symbolism and to not possibly read into it as well as an allegory of child sexual abuse. And then on top of that, I mean, this becomes even more disturbing when you consider some of the individuals in Kubrick's life. And one of the most shocking discoveries that I turned up had to do with James B. Harris, who was Kubrick's early production partner. He produced Lolita actually with Kubrick. He had also produced The Killing. I mean, they essentially had the Harris Kubrick productions in the early days. And I found out that James B. Harris had actually had a relationship with Sue Loines during the filming of Lolita, and it continued on for several years afterwards. And again, Sue Loines was 15 when Lolita was being filmed, and James B. Harris was 39 years old. So this is definitely very much an Epstein-like relationship here. There's been a lot of indications that have subsequently come out that this definitely was quite abusive and was not entirely a consensual relationship. Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and Papas, who was a very close friend of Sue Loin, had known her since she was a preteen, has argued that the relationship with Harris ruined Sue Loin's life. So there's definitely a lot of indications there that this was very traumatic. It was unfolding on Kubrick's set. And then on top of that, Kubrick was also a good friend of Roman Polanski's. It was another thing that I had found out, and he had been a friend of Polanski's since the late 60s. Polanski had actually screened The Fearless Vampire Killers for Kubrick at his estate. He had invited Kubrick to attend his bachelor bash at the Playboy Club in LA in '68, which Kubrick had probably wisely avoided. So it's another case there. Again, he knows Polanski. He remained friends with Polanski even after the allegations, which basically subsequently been confirmed, of Polanski being a serial child rapist. So there is a lot of this darkness surrounding Kubrick's life. And certainly when you look at Lolita, there seems to be even hints of certain inside knowledge as to how maybe some of these establishment pedophiles operate. So that was something that was really difficult for me in writing this book, but it was something inevitably that I had to consider. And I really did, though, come to the conclusion that Kubrick did not molest his daughters. In fact, I really think that becoming a father was a transformative experience for Kubrick in that regard. And I think that you can almost see that in the contrast between Carol Quigley's character in Lolita versus the Jack Nicholson character, Jack Torrance in The Shining. Because Quilty is, he's a very magnetic character, even though he's totally a monstrous figure as played by Peter Sellers. You can't help but almost feel sympathy for him. I mean, he's certainly the most interesting character in the film. He's always just hypnotic whenever he's on the screen. So there is almost this awe surrounding this character in Lolita. But by contrast with the Jack Torrance character in The Shining, I mean, he's really depicted as being a rather pathetic figure. You get the strong sense that he's a hack novelist. He's a drunk. He can't support his family. He's basically washed out of everything. He's now reduced to trying to be a caretaker for a hotel over the winter. There's almost a lot of contempt, I think, oozing from Kubrick in terms of this character. And as I had started to consider this, I almost felt that this was Kubrick, in a sense, maybe exercising some of his demons and making this, and really a lot of his other movies. I mean, with Eyes Wide Shut as well, I feel like you almost, you have almost like an air of Dickens' A Christmas Carol or something like that in it, where you see the different pasts and futures of it. And I almost feel that the Tom Cruise character could be seen as a stand-in for Kubrick, and he's seeing the different paths that really I think that his daughters could be taking in this movie, where you see the young prostitute that Cruise confronts early in the film, later the daughter of the society individual who's just deceased, who basically throws herself at him, obviously the women at the Somerton orgy, and even to some extent the Alice character. I think that it's very telling when you look at Eyes Wide Shut. Almost every woman in that film is a prostitute in some form or other, which was another pretty dramatic change that Kubrick had made for the book. And to me, it's almost a reflection on what I think Kubrick saw in that world as he was kind of in that period of social climbing early in his career, and the choices ultimately that he had to make in terms of whether or not he was going to exist in that world or not. So it's a lot of darkness in that regard that appears in Eyes Wide Shut and Lolita and The Shining and a lot of his films, I think, hinting at this, and potentially a lot of the personal struggles that he went through, because I do think, this was sort of ultimately my conclusion in the title of the book. The Minotaur was this darkness in Kubrick's soul, and the labyrinth were the films that I think in a lot of ways were his means of constructing a labyrinth to contain this darkness, to contain the Minotaur within it.
Beautifully said, and I would agree. And even then, too, there's the other movie, and that is A Clockwork Orange. Now, I've read Anthony Burgess' novel many times, and I also read the Lost Chapter, which is so bizarre that was not included in the United States. It still blows me away how A Clockwork Orange really ends. It's kind of, yeah, but I don't remember this in the novel, but in the movie, part of what makes Alex DeLarge a monster besides the, the socialist landscape, the poverty, the dystopia, the parents who are disattached and watching TV, but is the fact that he is being sexually molested by his whatever teacher or principal.
Yeah,
and it
I
does
think
show it
it's
in
his
the movie.
parole officer. Yeah, it's his parole officer.
Whatever it is. That's part of what makes Alex a monster, is that he has nothing to protect himself in society, so he just lashes out at culture. But I wonder what Stanley Kubrick's saying about his childhood. I don't know if you know what I mean? It's I'll have to see if they have that in the novel. I'll have to double check. But
yeah, I'm not sure if it was as pronounced. And then, well, also too, you can kind of look at the sequence when Alex is in the prison as well, because it's very strongly implied that he was sexually insulted by some of the looks that he gets. So which again, I mean, is another thing that I think that's a really fascinating thing for Kubrick to throw in there, and it's something that's never really talked about at all, because again, for decades the debate in the United States was always that prisons aren't tough enough. I mean, just look at this shit. The inmates, they have bicycles and they have TVs. I mean, obviously this is like a country club atmosphere. It's like, yeah, until they get anally raped. And again, think about what a traumatic experience that is for the countless amount of men who have gone through there. And many of them, as younger men, go in there and have their first experience of being anally raped. And then we sort of wonder, well, why in the United States do we have so many repeat offenders? Why do people come out more violent than they went in? Well, gosh, I mean, I'm sure being fucked in the ass didn't help their disposition at all, huh?
Yeah, it's an intense film and a book as far as social engineering and philosophy, and I think socially might be still the most relevant of all his movies. Well, Dr. Strangelove too, because we are.
We're now reliving the Cold War.
Yeah, we're being led to the brink of destruction and annihilation by some idiots at the top. The premier loves a good surprise, or you know what I mean. And yeah, I'm Mr. President. I'm not saying we won't get our hair mussed. 20 or 30 million tops. And as you say, that is something that the CIA and the government did talk about, right?
Yeah, no, this was like literally I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but this is like literally a conversation Kennedy was having at the National Security Council, because they have been pushing for a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union in '63. And, he asked them, well, how many Americans have died? Well, 20, 30 million, maybe, Mr. President. We think it would be okay.
Oh my God. Yeah. This is who's leading us. And yeah, I mean, and I know Alan Dulles wanted always strikes in East Europe, and this is in the 50s. So it's a mess. It really is a mess. So, looks like the deep state must have gotten Graham. Hopefully he'll come back. Because I wanted to ask a question now that we get to the end, as we're getting towards the end. Anything else you want to talk about in your book that you want the audience to share that's unique? For example, you do talk about Kubrick's adventures making in Ireland and dealing with the IRA, which is a whole story in itself, and so many other things about your book that you do tackle.
Well, I think the one big thing that I really had gotten into at length in this, and I think this has been so overlooked with Kubrick, are the possible links that he had to the Kennedy family.
Yeah,
And this
yeah,
is
that's
something that,
true.
you know, that really goes all the way back to Dr. Strangelove, because I firmly believe that this was one of several films that people close to the Kennedy administration were using to leak information to the American public about essentially the state of the U.S. military and essentially how unhinged they had gotten at this particular juncture in history in 1963 or so. But there's just so much recurring with this throughout Kubrick's career. I mean, of course, the last year that he sets foot in American soil was 1968. He never came back to this country, even for the funeral of his mother or his father. 68 is also the year that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And then later, as I get into a lot in the book, Kubrick is active in Ireland during the Troubles there. And this is also during the time frame when Ted Kennedy is very active in Ireland, trying to raise awareness for the plight of the Catholics in Northern Ireland at the time. So there's a lot of these just really interesting parallels between what Kubrick is doing and also some of the issues that the Kennedy family was pushing. But it gets even more interesting when you consider a guy who worked closely with Kubrick for many years, and that was Anthony Frewen. And Frewen is, he essentially became Kubrick's director of research by the 1980s. He was the guy who was reading a lot of novels for Kubrick to write synopsis and see if they would be worth adapting. And then he was also later, when Kubrick could figure out the films that he was going to do, was the guy who was doing a lot of research for Kubrick. But the thing about Frewen that I found out is that he, since the 1980s onward, was very involved with the JFK assassination research community in the UK, to the point that he had actually contributed to Lobster magazine fairly regularly during the 80s, and he had continued to contribute to Lobster all the way up to at least around 2010 or so. And this is really interesting because Kubrick really micromanaged his employees a lot. I mean, there's all these stories about how he dealt with writers. I think there was one where he was under contract to Kubrick, and this is during a junction where Kubrick was working on another project. They weren't even working on the script that he had hired this guy to write. So he thought, well, okay, I'm going to go speak at this convention in the southern part of England. And then he goes and does this, and he sends Stanley Kubrick a postcard telling him, you know, how he hopes that he's doing well and can't wait to get back to working on the script and this kind of thing. And the response he gets from Kubrick is a lawsuit because he's in breach of contract for doing this speaking engagement while he was under contract with Kubrick for the script. So this is, you know, how Kubrick dealt with his employees. So Frewen is his top research guy. And then at the same time, he's doing all of this stuff with the JFK assassination research community. So I really feel like Kubrick, at a minimum, had to have been aware of Freewen's engagement in it. And given how image conscious Kubrick was, I have to think that a minimum he tactically approved of Frewen being active in the JFK assassination research community. And I tried to talk to some people in the community about Frewen, and they were maybe a little cagey about discussing him, but it was interesting that they were aware that he worked for Stanley Kubrick during this time frame. But apparently it was just something that, you know, nobody really talked about, even though it was known, which is another interesting thing. But again, you know, if you've seen Dr. Strangelove, it just seems inescapable that Kubrick was looking at some of the same groups linked to the JFK assassination. So, you know, you really got to wonder, did nobody ever at least once think to ask, you know, Anthony Frewen, so, you know, off the record, what does Stanley think about all of this? You know, but this is kind of another thing when you think about it. So also, you know, he's a fan of the realist. Stanley Kubrick is. Paul Krasner is also a big figure. in the parapolitical community, thanks to his patronage at May Brussels. And then Freeland's also working in the JFK assassination research community. He's getting to know some of the top people involved in this community through that, and his work with Lobster Magazine. Of course, Lobster's got some great researchers in it, people like Stephen Dorff, Robin Ramsey. So it's kind of another thing I had to wonder about this, not just possibly Kubrick's links to the Kennedy family, but also was Kubrick maybe subtly interacting with the parapolitical and conspiracy communities, maybe even dropping some hints that were being subtly relayed to them from time to time.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Like you said, he was controlling his image. And we talk about Kubrick doing research on Bowie and Elvis. They were exactly the same. They worked every little move, every little bad publicity. You know what I mean? It was a game of cards, and they were good at playing this game of cards with a mixture of instinct and logic, playing the odds. So
yeah, well, I mean, everybody knows Kubrick was a phenomenal chess player. He was also a great poker player too. So I mean, there you go.
Well, as we get to the end, Graham, I'm going to let you end. Do you have any last question or comment for Stephen?
The last question I have is, can I put the director's cut of Eyes Wide Shut on my Christmas list this year? I've been wanting that for a while.
If only it'll ever come out one of these days, man. That's I think we would all.
There is one in the works, or
I think he's being facetious.
But I was gonna say the Snider cut, Stanley Kubrick, Eyes Wide Shut. Oh wow, that would be good. Graham, what's your favorite Kubrick? Did you say? Oh, you did say Barry Lyndon.
Yeah, Barry Lyndon's probably my favorite, and I got a soft spot for Spartacus as well.
Spartacus is another underrated one. I can definitely see that.
It is. Yeah, it's got. I don't. For some reason, I can't even handle Kirk Douglas, because this is Jason Horsley's research that Kirk Douglas sexually assaulted a very young Natalie Wood, and I always think that's just.
He was also
of course, nobody could say anything about it, but poor Natalie Wood's psyche was broken for the rest of her career.
Yeah, I mean, that was another guy big in Kubrick's early career too. So I mean, this is kind of another figure with like a certain amount of darkness surrounding him as well.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, yeah, stay away from Babylon or Hollywood. Yeah, I agree. I like that movie Babylon. I think it's a good. It didn't make a lot of money, but it is a good snapshot of what.
Oh, it was great. It was great. I found that bizarre too, because then everybody loved the director's earlier movie, Damon Castell's earlier movie. What was it, La La Land? I think.
La La Land.
I really did not think was that great at all.
I only watched half and I stopped watching. But Babylon.
Yeah, Babylon.
I love this ride. This is a ride.
Yeah, that was a great.
Does it deal with any occult secret society stuff? I think.
I don't think. I mean, I don't think it directly references it per se, but I definitely think that if you know the sort of darker history to Hollywood, there's a lot of very subtle references to that kind of stuff.
Definitely. Well, awesome. Well, everybody, please check out Stephen's book. I have it on the show notes already. Just where do you want to send people to buy it? Just Amazon?
Just head over to Amazon. If you head over to my blog, Visa, there's also links there to where you can get the online version, the PDF, and all that other good stuff if you are so inclined. So definitely consider giving it a shot. It was definitely a labor of love, and I like to think that at least there's some new research in there about Kubrick that a lot of people aren't familiar with.
Indeed. And what's the blog again? I didn't know you had a blog. I thought you only had Facebook, Patreon, and
that's the Visa blog. That was how I got into all this way back in the day. Yeah, visaview.blogspot.com. That's VISUPVIEW, all one word, .blogspot.com.
Cool. And any books you're working on? Or
well, definitely the follow up to the art, the second one. Well, I never take a break on anything, bro. But I'm hoping that I can finally start work on the second book of the art here in the next couple of months. I got to write the presentation for Astronosis first, but that's definitely in the pipe, though.
Be like Kubrick, 18 hours. Yeah, I mean, after we're done here, I'm gonna spend time with the kids, my wife, blah, blah. And around 11 at night, I'm going to work on this Bowie book. It's like, you know,
Yeah.
you got to squeeze time where you find it. So
Absolutely.
it is the world. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your support, Chester. Thank you, everybody, for coming on the show and listening. And I hope you enjoy it. If you're listening on the audio version, which will be out tomorrow. Yeah, again, please support Aeon Byte in any way you can. Patreon, donations, buy the Gnostic Tarot, anything you can do to keep the lights of the Pleroma on, and definitely support Steven's work because he brings out just game-changing and very edifying research on so many topics. But we are at the end. First, I'm going to say, Graham, thanks for keeping us company on this Odyssey, 2024 Odyssey, Space Odyssey.
Always a pleasure. Looking forward to next time.
Likewise. Well, Stephen, as always, thank you for coming. And yeah, we certainly look forward to your presentation and company and all that good stuff at Astronosis. And maybe the next time we can hang out at Graceland.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. And yeah, you guys definitely think about coming and visiting us out here at Astronosis. It's going to be quite a time.
It'll be great. So awesome. Well, everybody, please take care of yourself. Yeah, please do some correct theurgy and Gnostic rituals to fly you to the moon, the real moon, to go beyond Saturn, and to reach a place where, well, you'll find out that you are a star and you are an authentic human being who can make a difference, who has value, and who can change and bring light to this very dark universe. That's how I'll end. Everybody take care and thank you.
Thank you.